The night was quiet, too quiet. The city of Memphis had always been a blend of loud, late-night sounds, but tonight it was a different kind of silence. In the middle of a sleepy residential neighborhood, something sinister was brewing behind closed doors. Inside the modest two-story home of Aaron Williams and his family, the kind of silence that hung in the air was more chilling than comforting. Aaron, a 34-year-old correctional officer, was supposed to be on shift tonight, but instead he found himself standing in the dimly lit kitchen, staring blankly at the clock on the wall. His wife, Claire, had been dead for hours now. He was supposed to love her, but now the weight of what he had done pressed heavily on his chest. It had all started 1 month ago. Claire had just given birth to their second child, a beautiful baby girl named Emily. The new mother was exhausted from the labor and the challenges of caring for a newborn, but still, she had made time to try to make her marriage work. She had always been the loving, understanding wife, the kind of woman who did everything for her family. But little did she know, Aaron had begun to weave a web of lies that would eventually trap her in a deadly situation. In the weeks leading up to Claire's death, Aaron had grown more distant. He had fallen into an affair with his stepdaughter, Mia, who had just turned 18. Mia had moved in with them a few years ago after her mother, Aaron's first wife, had passed away. As time went on, Aaron's relationship with Mia grew more complicated. It was hard to pinpoint when things started to turn inappropriate, but it was clear by now that Aaron had crossed a line. Mia had become more than just a stepdaughter to him. He began sneaking around, meeting her secretly, and engaging in an illicit relationship that, in his mind, was the only thing that made him feel alive. It was a dangerous, reckless affair, but Aaron couldn't stop himself. The lies piled up. He had convinced Claire that he was working late at the prison or attending training sessions for his job, all the while sneaking away to be with Mia. Aaron knew he had to keep his secret hidden, especially now that Claire had become increasingly suspicious. She had noticed the late-night phone calls, the unexplained absences, and the sudden coldness in Aaron's demeanor. Claire loved him dearly, but her intuition told her something was wrong. One night she confronted him. Her voice was trembling, filled with anxiety and concern. "Aaron, what's going on? You're never here anymore. I know something's wrong. Are you seeing someone else?" Aaron's heart raced. He had never been good at lying to her, but he had to keep up the act. His mind raced for an excuse. "It's work, Claire. You know how demanding my job is. Please just trust me. It's nothing." But Claire's eyes didn't soften. She stared at him with the kind of look that made him realize how much she suspected. "It's not just work, Aaron. I can feel it. You're pulling away from me, and I don't know why." Her words haunted him in the days that followed. Claire's suspicion was growing, and he couldn't risk her finding out the truth. The thought of losing everything, his wife, his family, was too much to bear. Aaron had always been the kind of man who could control his emotions, but now he felt cornered. There was only one way to fix the mess he had made. It wasn't long before Aaron came up with a plan. He knew that Claire, exhausted from childbirth, would be easy to manipulate. He could make her believe that he was still the loving husband she thought he was. And so, one fateful evening, when Claire was nursing the baby in the nursery, Aaron decided it was time. He had grabbed the gun from the drawer in the kitchen, a weapon he had kept for years but had never used. It was simple, quiet, efficient. He would make it look like an accident, a tragic incident. He knew how to cover his tracks. After all, he had spent years in a prison, dealing with criminals who were much more dangerous than he was. He was a man of control, of precision, and tonight, he would take control of his own fate. Aaron stood outside the nursery door, took a deep breath, and entered. He found Claire sitting in a rocking chair, holding Emily in her arms. The sight of his newborn daughter filled him with a twisted sense of guilt, but it was too late to turn back now. Claire looked up at him, her face soft with exhaustion. "Aaron," she whispered, her voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "You're home." "Yeah, I'm here," he said, trying to force a smile. He stepped closer, his hand slowly sliding into his jacket pocket. He had rehearsed this moment 100 times in his mind. "I'm sorry, Claire. I really am," he whispered, more to himself than to her. The words felt like poison in his mouth. Claire's eyes narrowed. For what, Aaron? For a brief moment he hesitated, but the weight of his secret was too much. He had to end it. He had to make her disappear so he could be free to live the life he wanted, without her. Aaron pulled the gun from his jacket, pointed it at Claire, and without a word pulled the trigger. The sound of the shot echoed in the small nursery. Claire's body slumped to the side, and Emily began to cry. For a moment, time stood still. Aaron stood there staring at the blood-stained walls, his heart pounding in his chest. It was over. He had done it. But little did he know, this would only be the beginning. The investigation into Claire's death would soon uncover more than he could ever imagine. And one seasoned investigator, Detective Rachel Hunter, would bring everything to light. Detective Rachel Hunter stood on the outskirts of the crime scene, her eyes scanning the modest house in front of her. The moonlight cast long shadows over the property, but the bright lights of the police cars gave the scene a stark, clinical look. Rachel had seen more crime scenes than she cared to remember, but something about this one felt off. There was an unnatural stillness about it, a quiet that didn't belong. She adjusted her jacket and walked toward the front door, where Officer Daniels stood waiting. He nodded as she approached, a silent acknowledgement of her arrival. "Detective, it's all yours," Daniels said, gesturing toward the house. His voice was low, almost reverent. He had worked with Rachel long enough to know that she didn't like pleasantries. She liked facts. Rachel stepped into the entryway. The house was tidy, almost sterile, as if the tragedy that had occurred there just hours before hadn't quite settled in yet. The scent of fresh paint mixed with the faint odor of baby formula, a jarring reminder that the life of a young mother had been snuffed out in the blink of an eye. "Who found the body?" Rachel asked, her voice steady but sharp. "Her husband, Aaron Williams," Daniels replied. "He called 911 around 10:45 p.m. Said his wife was dead, shot in the nursery. Claims it was an accident. He's been cooperating, but there's something about him that doesn't sit right." Rachel nodded, mentally making a note of the husband's behavior. "Have you spoken to him yet?" "Yeah, he's in the living room, talking to the officers. He's pretty shaken up, but he insists it was an accident." Rachel's instincts immediately kicked in. Accidents were rare when it came to shootings. Most of the time, the shooter had a motive, whether it was a crime of passion, self-defense, or cold-blooded murder. An accident? Not so much. "Let's talk to him," Rachel said, and walked through the house to the living room. Aaron Williams was sitting on the couch, his hands resting in his lap, his expression blank. He looked exhausted, his face pale, his eyes red from crying, or pretending to cry. He was a tall man with a strong build, but he seemed small in that moment, vulnerable. Rachel had seen men like him before, men who were good at hiding their true feelings, men who could look sad and remorseful, even though their hearts were filled with something else entirely. Rachel sat down across from him. She didn't speak right away. She just let the silence stretch out, watching him carefully. It was a technique she often used to gauge reactions, to see if someone would crack under pressure. Aaron shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting nervously to the floor. "Detective, I didn't mean for this to happen," he said, his voice shaky. "I don't know what went wrong. I was trying to clean the gun, and it just went off. I didn't even realize Claire was in the room." Rachel kept her gaze steady on him, her face neutral. "You were cleaning a gun in the nursery, where your wife was with your newborn child?" Aaron nodded vigorously. "Yes, I didn't mean to. I thought she was in the kitchen. I didn't even hear her come in." "And you didn't hear your daughter crying afterward?" Rachel pressed, her voice calm but insistent. Aaron hesitated. His gaze flickered toward the door, as though he were looking for an escape. I didn't know what to do. I panicked. I called 911 right away, but I was too late." Rachel watched him closely. His story was full of holes, and she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands trembled slightly. He was hiding something. She was sure of it. "But what?" "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Williams," she said softly, letting a moment of silence hang in the air. "But I need to ask you a few more questions." Aaron nodded again, his eyes darting back and forth, clearly trying to figure out if he could manipulate the situation. Where was the gun kept? Rachel asked. It was in the drawer in the kitchen, Aaron replied quickly. I kept it for safety. I didn't think anyone would be around when I was cleaning it. It was just a mistake. How often do you clean the gun? Rachel asked, her voice more direct now. Aaron frowned slightly. I, I don't clean it. Often. Just when I think it's needed. It's a thing I do, after long shifts, just to make sure it's in good condition. Rachel made a mental note of that. She had worked enough homicide cases to know that most people didn't clean their guns unless they were planning to use them. And Aaron Williams had been a correctional officer for over 10 years. He knew guns. He knew how to handle them safely. Something about his story just didn't add up. Where were you exactly when the shooting happened? She asked. I was in the kitchen, Aaron said, his voice tight. I was cleaning the gun, and I heard a noise. I thought it was Claire, but I didn't know she had come into the nursery until after it happened. I don't know how it happened. Rachel studied him for a long moment. His face was flushed, his lips tight as though he were struggling to hold back the truth. His behavior was telling. His fear wasn't about the death of his wife. It was about something else, something deeper. Rachel stood up, her mind racing. There was more to this story than Aaron was letting on. She couldn't prove it yet, but she could feel it in her gut. The way he fidgeted, the inconsistencies in his story, the coldness in his eyes. It wasn't the grief of a man who had lost his wife. It was the fear of a man who had just made the biggest mistake of his life. I'll be back, she said, her voice firm. I need to talk to a few more people. Aaron didn't say anything, just nodded, his eyes following her as she walked toward the door. He looked relieved that she was leaving, but Rachel wasn't fooled. She knew that the truth was just waiting to be uncovered, and she was going to find it, no matter what. As she stepped out of the house and into the cool night air, Rachel felt the weight of the case settling in. The husband's alibi was full of holes, and the crime scene was too clean. She needed more information, and she knew exactly where to get it. The next step in the investigation was to talk to those closest to Aaron Williams, his stepdaughter Mia, his co-workers, and anyone who might have seen or heard anything that didn't add up. Rachel's instincts told her this wasn't just a tragic accident, it was murder, and she was going to prove it. Detective Rachel Hunter stood in front of the Williams house, reviewing the notes she had jotted down during her initial conversation with Aaron. There were too many inconsistencies for her to ignore. The gun cleaning in the nursery, the nervous demeanor of Aaron, and the fact that the story didn't match the reality of a trained correctional officer were enough to make Rachel question the entire scenario. But there was still something nagging at her, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Aaron Williams had been too calm, too rehearsed in his grief. And then there was the matter of Mia, his stepdaughter. Rachel needed to speak with her next. If anyone knew the truth about the Williams household, it was Mia. She rang the doorbell, her mind running through a dozen questions she wanted to ask. The door opened, and standing in the doorway was a young woman, just barely 18, with a mixture of weariness and caution in her eyes. Mia. She was dressed in a loose-fitting sweatshirt and sweatpants, her hair pulled back into a messy ponytail, looking like someone who hadn't had a full night's sleep in weeks. Rachel could see the traces of worry etched into her face, as if she already knew why the detective had come calling. Mia Williams, Rachel asked, her voice gentle but authoritative. Mia nodded, stepping aside to let Rachel in. Please come in. Rachel entered the living room, which was smaller than she had expected for a two-story house. The furniture was arranged haphazardly, as though the family had been in a hurry or didn't have the energy to care about how their space looked. The faint sounds of a baby crying echoed from upstairs, but Mia didn't seem to react. It was as if she had already gotten used to the noise. I'm Detective Hunter. I'm investigating your mother's death, Rachel said softly, but she watched Mia carefully for any signs of distress. Mia's face remained unreadable, her eyes slightly distant. I know. I'm sorry. I don't know what to say. It's all been so overwhelming. Rachel didn't respond immediately, giving Mia a moment to process. She needed to see how Mia would react to the mention of her mother, and she needed to gauge the young woman's trustworthiness. There was something in the way Mia held herself, an air of tension, that made Rachel suspicious. After a pause, Rachel spoke again. Mia, I need to ask you about your stepfather, Aaron. Can you tell me what happened the night of your mother's death? Mia shifted uneasily in her seat. She looked down at her hands, which were clenched together tightly in her lap. I don't know much, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I was in my room. I heard the shot, and then I heard Aaron screaming. Where were you when it happened? Rachel pressed. Mia hesitated, her eyes darting to the side as though searching for an answer that would satisfy the detective. Finally she spoke, but her words were slow and measured. I was in my room. I didn't go down to the nursery. I didn't even know. Not until later. Rachel nodded, absorbing her words. What's your relationship like with Aaron? Mia's expression shifted for a brief moment. Her lips tightened, and her gaze turned colder, distant. He's my stepfather. That's all. Rachel leaned in slightly, noting the subtle change in Mia's behavior. Is it a good relationship? There was a long pause before Mia spoke again, her voice quieter now, almost as though she were considering the question too carefully. We don't talk much. He works long hours. And after my mom passed, he's been distant. Rachel watched her carefully. There was something off about the way Mia spoke. Her responses were too careful, too rehearsed. It was almost as if she were trying to protect Aaron. But from what? From whom? I've also been told that you were close to your mom, Rachel said, trying to steer the conversation toward Mia's mother, Claire. How did she seem in the days leading up to her death? Mia's face softened slightly at the mention of her mother, but the sadness in her eyes didn't quite reach her voice. She was tired. She had a baby to take care of, and it was hard for her. She was also worried about Aaron, but I think she just wanted everything to be okay. She didn't want to fight. Rachel's instincts were tingling. This wasn't the answer she had expected. Mia had barely mentioned her mother's death, and her tone didn't indicate any grief. She was suspiciously detached. Could it be that Mia knew more than she was letting on? I've been told you were close with Aaron, Rachel said, leaning forward, trying to provoke some kind of reaction. Mia stiffened visibly, her eyes flickering up to meet Rachel's. What do you mean by that? I mean that I heard you were spending a lot of time together recently. That you were close, Rachel said, her voice calm but probing. For a moment, Mia was silent. Then, as if the weight of the question was too much to ignore, she spoke, her words spilling out faster now. Look, I don't know what you've heard, but it's not like that. Aaron's just been looking out for me. I lost my mom when I was young. I just needed someone. Rachel studied her face, trying to decipher the truth in her words. I understand, Mia. But what about Aaron? How did he seem after your mother's death? Mia looked down, her fingers twisting together as though she were trying to hold herself together. He was different. I don't know how to explain it. It was like he wasn't even there anymore. He kept to himself a lot. Sometimes he'd come into my room and we'd talk, but I didn't really think anything of it. It was just, he was there, and I was there. Rachel's gut twisted. There was more to this, something Mia wasn't telling her. Mia's behavior was unusual. Her hesitations, her guarded answers, the way she couldn't maintain eye contact when speaking about her stepfather. The lines between what was appropriate and what was not seemed blurred in this house. The detective could see that Mia was struggling to protect someone, but Rachel wasn't sure if it was out of loyalty or fear. Mia, Rachel said, her tone softening slightly. I know this is difficult, but if there's something you're not telling me, it's important. The truth will come out sooner or later, and it's better if you're honest with me now. Mia's eyes flickered with something. Was it guilt? Fear? But she didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stood up, pacing for a moment before turning back to face Rachel. I don't know if I can do that, she said, her voice shaky. I don't know what's happening anymore. Rachel didn't push her further. Sometimes the best way to get to the truth was to let the person come to it on their own. I understand, Mia, Rachel said, but I need to ask you one more thing before I go. Did Aaron ever mention anything about cleaning the gun? Was there ever a time when he talked about it around you? Mia's face turned pale at the mention of the gun. She shook her head quickly. Never. He didn't talk to me about it. Rachel stood up, noting the shift in Mia's demeanor. She had said something that had caused a reaction. Mia's reaction spoke volumes. "I'll be in touch," Rachel said, turning to leave. "If you remember anything, anything at all, please let me know." Mia didn't respond, but her eyes followed Rachel as she walked toward the door. Rachel's mind was racing. Something wasn't right in this household. Mia was hiding something, and Aaron was hiding something too. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but there was still much more to uncover. As Rachel stepped out into the cool evening air, she couldn't shake the feeling that the dark truth was waiting just beneath the surface, and the more she dug, the more dangerous it would become. Detective Rachel Hunter sat in her car, parked a few streets away from the Williams home, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she mulled over the conversation she had just had with Mia. The young woman's behavior had been unsettling. The way she avoided direct answers, the way she faltered when asked about her stepfather, Aaron. It was clear Mia was hiding something, and Rachel was beginning to suspect that it was more than just a stepfather-daughter bond. The subtle tension in Mia's voice when talking about Aaron, combined with her inability to maintain eye contact when asked about the gun, had set off alarms in Rachel's mind. Mia's body language told a different story than her words did. There was a disconnect, something Rachel had seen countless times in her career. People rarely gave away the truth in their words alone. They gave it away in the small, telling details of how they acted. Rachel knew that if Mia was involved in the case, either directly or indirectly, there was more she needed to understand about the relationship between Mia and Aaron, but she needed hard evidence. She needed something concrete, something undeniable. Her mind wandered back to Aaron. He had told her that the shooting was an accident, that he had been cleaning his gun and hadn't realized Claire was in the nursery. But Rachel's gut told her it was a lie. Correctional officers knew guns. They knew how to handle them, clean them, and most importantly, when not to keep them loaded or within easy reach of a potential tragedy. The fact that Aaron had even suggested such a mistake, that he hadn't checked the chamber before handling it, felt hollow. He was trained for these situations. He knew better. Rachel thought about Aaron's story. The gun was in the kitchen drawer. Claire was sitting in the nursery with the baby, and Aaron was in the kitchen, cleaning the gun without knowing Claire had entered. Too many details didn't add up. And what about Mia? Why did she seem so distant, so guarded, when asked about her stepfather? Determined to dig deeper, Rachel turned her attention to Aaron's life outside the house. She needed to know more about his interactions with Mia and the nature of their relationship. If Aaron was hiding something, it wouldn't be long before it started to unravel. But Rachel also needed to look at his background, his history as a correctional officer, any potential issues or complaints about his behavior in the prison system, and most importantly, any past relationships or people who could speak to his character. The next morning, Rachel made her way to the police station, ready to start digging through Aaron Williams' records. She first went to the officer in charge of the prison where Aaron worked, hoping to find some insights into his professional life. She was led to Officer Sam Jansen, who had worked closely with Aaron for several years. "Detective Hunter, how can I help you?" Officer Jansen greeted her as she entered his office. He was a tall man, mid-40s, with a scruffy beard and a permanent frown, a typical prison officer. "I'm investigating the death of Aaron Williams's wife, Claire," Rachel said, skipping formalities. "I need to know more about his work history, his conduct, anything unusual. You've worked with him for some time. Anything come to mind?" Officer Jansen raised an eyebrow. "You know, I've been working with Aaron for years. Good guy, tough, serious, but dedicated. But lately, he'd been a little different. Kind of distant." "Distant how?" Rachel asked, leaning forward. Jansen rubbed the back of his neck. "Well, he'd been keeping to himself a lot more. He was a bit of a loner to begin with, but this was different. Around the time his wife gave birth, he started acting a little strange. Kind of on edge, like he was hiding something." Rachel's brow furrowed. "Anything specific? Conversations? Behavior? Something that raised red flags?" Jansen paused, thinking. "There were a few times he'd come in looking like he hadn't slept. And one time we had this conversation, kind of out of the blue. He asked me if I knew anything about the way people handle their personal lives when they've got, let's say, complicated situations at home." He looked uncomfortable, as though the conversation was private for a reason. Rachel pressed on. What kind of complicated situations? Jansen looked at her carefully before answering. He didn't give details, but it seemed like he was talking about a relationship that wasn't quite above board. He said something about feeling like he was stuck between his duty at work and some personal mess that was making him feel conflicted. Did he mention anyone by name? Rachel asked sharply. No, not exactly, Jansen said slowly. But it was clear he wasn't talking about his wife. It was someone else. Rachel's pulse quickened. She had suspected something was off, but now she had confirmation that Aaron was involved in something beyond a simple workplace stress issue. The fact that Aaron had been dealing with a complicated situation pointed directly to the possibility of an affair. But who was the other person? Did you ever see anything suspicious? Any behavior that made you question him? Rachel asked. Jansen thought for a moment, then shook his head. Nothing that I could really pin down. But there was one time I remember he acted pretty defensive when someone brought up his family. He got this look in his eye, like he was hiding something. But it's hard to say. Rachel nodded. There was something going on in Aaron's personal life, something that he wasn't willing to share with his colleagues. But it seemed like his professional behavior was starting to crack under the pressure of whatever he was hiding. She thanked Jansen and left the station with a new lead. Aaron's affair. It was clear that Aaron's relationship with Mia was becoming more and more suspicious. The way he had reacted when Rachel asked about her earlier, that coldness, that shift in his demeanor, wasn't just the behavior of a concerned stepfather. It was the behavior of someone trying to protect a secret that, if discovered, could destroy his life. Rachel's next step was to speak to Mia again. She needed to press her harder to see if Mia would crack under more direct questioning. Something was wrong in that house, and Rachel could feel the walls closing in on the truth. When Mia answered the door, her face was a mixture of exhaustion and wariness. Detective Hunter, what's going on? I need to ask you more questions, Mia, Rachel said firmly, stepping into the house without waiting for an invitation. And this time, I need you to be honest with me. Mia stepped back, clearly uncomfortable. I already told you everything I know. Rachel looked at her closely. No, you didn't. And I know there's more you're hiding. This isn't just about your stepfather and your mom anymore. This is bigger than that. Mia's face flushed with color, but she said nothing. I know about the affair, Rachel said bluntly. I know about you and Aaron. Mia's eyes widened, and for a moment, she looked like a deer caught in headlights. Then slowly, her expression hardened. That's not true, she said, her voice trembling. Rachel stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. You're lying, and if you keep lying to me, you're going to get yourself wrapped up in something much worse than you can imagine. Mia flinched, her eyes filling with tears. I don't know what you want from me, she whispered. Rachel's gaze softened, but her resolve was firm. I want the truth, Mia, and I need it now. Aaron didn't just kill your mother because of some accident. He did it to cover up his affair with you, and if you keep protecting him, you're going to be just as guilty. Mia shook her head, her tears now streaming down her face. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, she whispered as though she were speaking to herself more than to Rachel. Rachel took a step back, her mind racing. Mia was finally breaking. She was getting closer to the truth. But the full extent of the betrayal was yet to be revealed, and Aaron Williams was about to learn that his secrets wouldn't stay hidden for much longer. The afternoon sun cast long shadows over the Williams house as Detective Rachel Hunter sat at her desk, her mind swirling with the information she had uncovered. Mia's admission, though vague and reluctant, had confirmed the one thing Rachel had feared, the affair. Rachel had already suspected the relationship between Aaron and Mia was more complicated than a typical stepfather-daughter dynamic. But hearing Mia speak of it, even in such broken whispers, added a chilling layer to the case. This wasn't just about a woman's tragic death. It was about betrayal, manipulation, and a long-held secret that was finally beginning to surface. The more Rachel thought about it, the more the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. Aaron Williams, the devoted correctional officer, had a dark side, a side he had gone to great lengths to keep hidden from the world. And Mia, caught in the middle, had been too afraid to speak out, too loyal to her stepfather, or perhaps too deeply involved to even realize the danger she was in. But Rachel knew one thing for certain now. This wasn't just a case of a jealous husband or a tragic accident. It was murder, cold-blooded and premeditated. And Aaron was at the center of it all. Rachel sat back in her chair, flipping through the files on her desk. She had spoken with a few of Aaron's co-workers, and while none had openly admitted anything suspicious, Rachel's instincts told her the truth lay buried deeper. Correctional officers, by nature, were trained to be observant and cautious. Aaron had known exactly how to keep his secrets, and now it was up to Rachel to peel back the layers of deception and uncover what had really happened in the Williams household. The phone call came in late that evening. Rachel had just finished a meeting with her superior, and her mind was still processing the bits of information she had gathered. As soon as she saw the number on her phone, her heart skipped a beat. "It's me, Hunter," the voice on the other end said. It was Officer Sam Jansen, the one person who had provided her with the first hint of Aaron's troubled mind. "What's going on, Jansen?" Rachel asked, her voice steady but alert. "I need to tell you something," Jansen replied. "It's about Aaron. I didn't want to say anything before, but I think you should know." Rachel's pulse quickened. "What is it? What aren't you telling me?" There was a long pause before Jansen spoke again, his voice low. "Aaron's been acting weird lately, more than usual, but I didn't want to believe it, that a guy like him would actually, you know, go this far. But he's been talking about a plan, a way to get out of everything. He's been mentioning it in passing, like it's nothing. And I think it's more serious than I thought." "Plan?" Rachel's heart raced. "What do you mean, plan?" "I don't know the details, but it sounded like he was planning something, like he was preparing for a change, for something to go wrong. And I don't think it's just his job he's worried about." Rachel's mind began to race as she processed Jansen's words. A plan. Aaron had been preparing for something, perhaps for his wife's death, for the aftermath of his affair. He had known deep down that it would come to this. He would have to silence Claire to protect the secret he'd been harboring. But the question was, how far had he gone in executing this plan? Rachel needed answers, and she needed them fast. She couldn't afford to wait for Aaron to make his next move. "I'm coming to see you," Rachel said, her voice firm. "Tell me everything you know." The next morning, Rachel arrived at the small cafe where she had arranged to meet Johnson. As she entered, she spotted him sitting at a corner booth, his face tense as he sipped from a cup of coffee. Rachel slid into the seat across from him, her eyes scanning the room before focusing back on Jansen. "What did you mean by a plan?" she asked, leaning in slightly. Jansen took a deep breath, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. "I don't know all the details, but Aaron's been different lately. His conversations, the way he's been acting. It's like he's been setting something in motion. I thought it was just his personal life crashing down on him, but now looking back, I think he was preparing for something more drastic." Rachel nodded slowly. "Was he acting paranoid? Did he mention any specific things he was planning?" "Not exactly," Johnson replied, shaking his head. "But I remember him talking about the idea of starting over, moving away, getting out of town. He mentioned it a few times in passing, like it was a dream or a fantasy. But there was something about the way he said it, like it wasn't just some idle thought. He seemed serious, almost like he was making sure the pieces would fall into place." Rachel felt a chill run down her spine. It sounded like Aaron had been planning to get away with murder from the very beginning. He had just been waiting for the right moment, the right circumstances to strike. But what if he had already carried out the plan? What if he had already set everything in motion before Claire's death? "I need to look into Aaron's financials," Rachel said, her mind already racing with the next steps. "He might have been planning a way to disappear. Maybe he's been preparing for this for months." Jansen's expression darkened. "That's not all. I overheard something at the station. A few weeks ago, Aaron was talking to another officer, someone new. They were talking about weapons. He mentioned something about a clean shot and how he knew just where to aim. I thought he was talking about a training exercise, but now it sounds like he was preparing for something much darker." Rachel's eyes narrowed. This was it. Aaron's plan was coming into focus. He had been planning Claire's death with meticulous precision, using his training and his knowledge of weapons to make sure he could get away with it. But there was one thing Aaron hadn't accounted for: Rachel Hunter. The following days were a whirlwind of activity as Rachel and her team worked to dig deeper into Aaron's life. She obtained his financial records, his phone records, and even his find what she was looking for. Hidden among his transactions was a large, unexplained withdrawal just days before Claire's death. He had withdrawn a significant sum of money, money that could be used to disappear. Then Rachel found the final piece of the puzzle. Aaron's search history on his work computer showed multiple searches for disappearing without a trace, how to make a death look like an accident, and even best places to escape the law. It was clear now that Aaron had planned this for a long time. His entire life had been one big cover-up, hiding the affair, hiding his motives, and ultimately preparing for the day when Claire would have to die to protect him from exposure. But Rachel wasn't going to let him get away with it. She had the evidence now, everything she needed to bring Aaron Williams to justice. The moment Aaron Williams was arrested, his calm facade cracked. He had no idea that his secret life was about to be exposed. And when the detective revealed everything they had uncovered, he finally broke. The affair with Mia, the plans to escape, the meticulous preparation, it all came out in a torrent of guilt and anger. He had thought he could escape it all, that he could outrun the consequences of his actions. But Rachel Hunter had outsmarted him, and now Aaron Williams would face the full extent of the law. Mia, too, was arrested, not for the murder, but for her role in keeping Aaron's secret. Her complicity, her silence, had allowed the lies to fester. But Rachel knew that Mia was a victim in this as well. She had been manipulated, caught in a dangerous game she couldn't escape. As Rachel walked out of the courthouse, she felt the weight of the case lifting off her shoulders. Another case closed, but as always, there was one lingering thought in her mind. Sometimes the hardest part of solving a crime wasn't finding the truth. It was living with it once it was out in the open. The courtroom buzzed with quiet anticipation as the jury filed into their seats. The prosecution team, led by District Attorney William Davis, had spent weeks meticulously presenting their case against Aaron Williams. Every detail, every piece of evidence had been carefully laid out to show the extent of his betrayal, the planning, and the execution of Claire's murder. As the trial reached its final days, Rachel Hunter sat in the back row, watching intently. She had spent months working on the case, piecing together the fragments of Aaron's dark plan. It was now up to the jury to decide his fate. But for Rachel, it was more than just a professional case. It was personal. She had seen too many cases go unsolved, too many criminals slip through the cracks. But Aaron Williams wouldn't be one of them. Aaron sat at the defendant's table, his once pristine uniform now replaced by a gray jumpsuit. His face remained cold and unreadable, but Rachel could see the subtle signs of distress in his posture. He had been confident at the beginning of the trial, but as each day passed, that confidence had slowly eroded. The damning evidence, the phone records, the financial transactions, the hidden searches on his computer, everything pointed to him as the murderer. And then there was Mia, whose reluctant testimony had been the final nail in Aaron's coffin. Mia had broken down on the stand, her voice shaky as she recounted the affair with Aaron, how they had been caught in a web of deceit, and how she had kept quiet for fear of losing everything. Her words were not just an admission of guilt, but a cry for help, a realization that she had been manipulated and controlled by Aaron. Mia's testimony had been critical in painting the full picture of Aaron's intentions. He hadn't just killed Claire to protect his affair. He had planned it as a way to escape, to live with Mia in peace, free from the weight of their sins. Rachel could still hear Mia's voice echoing in her mind, her tearful confession. "I thought I could get away. I thought it would be better for all of us." But it wasn't. The truth had come out, and there was no turning back. The courtroom fell silent as the judge, Judge David Rourke, called for the closing statements. Rachel looked at Aaron one last time, her gaze unwavering. He was a man who had once appeared strong, confident, in control of his world. But now he looked like a shell of the man he had once been. She knew that, deep down, Aaron understood that his life was over. It didn't matter how many lies he had told, how many people he had manipulated. The truth was out now, and there was no hiding from it. District Attorney Davis rose to his feet, adjusting his glasses as he faced the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Davis began, his voice steady and clear, "we have presented overwhelming evidence in this case. The defendant, Aaron Williams, stood before you and claimed that his wife's death was a tragic accident, that he had no idea how the gun had gone off. But the truth is much darker. Aaron Williams planned his wife's murder, executing it with chilling precision to cover up his affair with his stepdaughter, Mia. He withdrew money, searched for ways to make a death look like an accident, and then, with cold calculation, took the life of a woman who had trusted him." Davis paused, allowing his words to sink in. This was no accident. This was murder. It was premeditated, and it was deliberate. Aaron Williams killed his wife to protect himself and to hide his secrets. The only thing that stands between him and justice is the truth that we have uncovered. You, the jury, have the power to hold him accountable for his actions. We ask that you return a verdict of guilty on all charges." Rachel's breath caught as she listened to Davis's words. His closing argument had been powerful, succinct, and damning. There was no denying it now. Aaron's fate was sealed. When the defense attorney, Leonard Grayson, stood to give his closing statement, he seemed less confident than Davis. Grayson was a seasoned lawyer, but the weight of the evidence against Aaron was impossible to ignore. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Grayson began, his tone somewhat defensive, "we don't deny that there are questions about Aaron Williams' actions. But what we ask you to remember is that this is a man who loved his wife. This is a man who has dedicated his life to serving as a correctional officer, a man who has spent his entire career helping others. Yes, he made mistakes. Yes, he had an affair. But that does not make him a murderer." Grayson's voice rose slightly. "We cannot convict a man based on conjecture and assumptions. Yes, there was money withdrawn, but how many of you have ever withdrawn money for an emergency or for personal reasons? Yes, there were questionable search histories, but that does not prove that Aaron Williams murdered his wife. We are all human. We all make mistakes. We cannot let personal emotions cloud our judgment." Grayson turned to the jury, his eyes sweeping across them. "I ask you to look at the facts. There is no clear evidence that Aaron Williams intentionally killed his wife. Yes, it's tragic, but accidents happen. This is a case of a man who has already lost everything: his wife, his family, his career. Don't let the prosecution use this tragedy to destroy a man who has already paid the price." Rachel felt the tension in the room grow. Grayson's words hung in the air, attempting to sway the jury, but she knew that his arguments were weak. The evidence spoke for itself. Aaron had planned the murder. He had premeditated it, and now he had to face the consequences. The jury deliberated for several hours, but Rachel could see the way the trial was leaning. Aaron's facade had cracked, and despite Grayson's best efforts, the truth had come to light. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the jury returned. The room fell silent as Judge Rourke addressed them. "Have you reached a verdict?" Judge Rourke asked. The foreman of the jury stood, his voice clear. "We have, Your Honor. We find the defendant, Aaron Williams, guilty of first-degree murder." A murmur of shock rippled through the courtroom, but Rachel didn't feel the surge of triumph she had expected. There was relief. Yes, relief that justice had been served. But there was also a sense of sorrow for the family, for the lives destroyed, for the secrets that had led to this moment. Aaron's face remained stoic, but his eyes, Rachel noticed for the first time, looked haunted. He had been convicted, and though he still had a chance to appeal, Rachel knew this was only the beginning of a long road ahead for him. The jury had spoken, and the truth had won. The weeks that followed the trial were filled with mixed emotions for Rachel. There was satisfaction in knowing that Aaron Williams had been held accountable for his crime, but there was also a heavy burden in seeing the shattered lives that remained in the wake of his actions. Mia, though not guilty of murder, would now live with the consequences of her choices for the rest of her life. She had been a victim of manipulation, but she had also been complicit in her silence. Rachel's thoughts often drifted back to Mia. She had been a young woman, lost and confused, caught between the man she thought she loved and the reality of what he had done. Now she had to find a way to rebuild her life, to come to terms with the part she had played in a tragedy that had been set in motion long before Claire Williams's death. Rachel knew that she couldn't fix everything. She couldn't undo the harm that had been caused, but she could take solace in the fact that justice had prevailed. As a detective, her job was to find the truth, no matter how painful it might be. And in this case, the truth had come out. It had been a long, difficult journey, but in the end, the truth was the only thing that mattered. Rachel walked out of the courthouse that day, her mind heavy with the weight of the case. The sky was clear, the sun shining brightly, but the world felt different. It always did after a case like this. She had won the battle, but the cost had been high. As she climbed into her car, she took a deep breath, ready to face the next case, the next challenge. But for now, she could rest, knowing that justice had been served, and that was enough. The crisp morning air of early fall swept through the small town of Crystal Valley as Rachel Hunter drove through the quiet streets, her eyes focused on the road. The trial of Aaron Williams had ended, but Rachel knew the ripples of his actions would be felt for a long time. The case had consumed her for months, and now, with the verdict in, the weight of it all had settled heavily on her shoulders. There was no feeling of triumph, no sense of closure. Instead, there was just an overwhelming sense of emptiness, the kind that only came after a battle had been fought and won, but at a cost. She had seen too many cases like this. She had worked countless hours piecing together the truth from lies, the facts from the smoke and mirrors that criminals tried to hide behind. But with each case, each investigation, there were always innocent lives that got caught in the crossfire. In the case of Aaron Williams, it wasn't just Claire who had suffered. Mia, too, had been a victim, and now Rachel found herself haunted by her role in the tragedy. Mia had been sentenced to 5 years of probation. While she hadn't been directly responsible for her stepmother's death, her silence had enabled Aaron's plot to succeed. The judge had recognized Mia's manipulation at the hands of Aaron, her fear, her lack of true agency. Still, Mia would have to face the consequences of her actions. Rachel hoped that with time, Mia would find a way to heal, though the scars would never fully fade. Rachel pulled into the parking lot of her office, the familiar sight of the police station grounding her in the present. She was grateful for the steady rhythm of her job, the constant rush of cases, the pressure, the challenge. It was all she knew how to do. But she couldn't shake the feeling that this case had changed her in a way that she wasn't sure she could define just yet. She walked into the building, past the rows of desks, her colleagues nodding at her as she passed. Detective Rachel Hunter was known for her sharp instincts and no-nonsense approach to solving cases. Yet now she couldn't help but feel a heaviness in her heart that didn't quite match the usual adrenaline rush that came with bringing a criminal to justice. It was the following week when Rachel received an unexpected call. She had just finished lunch when her phone buzzed on the table, displaying the name Mia Williams. Rachel hesitated for a moment, her finger hovering over the answer button. She had kept her distance from Mia after the trial. It wasn't because Rachel blamed her. Mia had been through a great deal herself, but because Mia needed space to process everything. Still, the fact that Mia was reaching out now made Rachel's curiosity get the better of her. She pressed accept and brought the phone to her ear. Mia! Rachel's voice was soft, trying to find the right tone. Detective Hunter. I need to talk to you. Mia's voice crackled, and Rachel could hear the faint tremor beneath her words. Rachel sat up straighter, instinctively knowing that this call would be important. What's going on? Is everything all right? I don't know if everything will ever be all right, Mia said quietly. But I need to tell you something. Something I never told anyone. Rachel's brow furrowed. What is it? There was a long pause before Mia spoke again. You were right. About everything. About my dad. And I never really understood what you were trying to tell me. That he was dangerous? That he was using me? But now I do. And I don't think I can ever make up for what I allowed him to do. But there's something else. Something I think you need to know. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. What is it, Mia? What are you trying to say? Mia took a deep breath. Before Claire died, my dad, Aaron, he made me promise something. He made me promise that if anything happened to her, if she died, I would never tell anyone about what really happened between us. What he did to me, he said he'd take care of it all, that it would be like nothing had ever happened. Rachel's stomach twisted. the memories of the investigation flashing in her mind. Mia had told her about the affair, but hearing it again, this time with the gravity of what had transpired, made Rachel's heart ache for the young woman who had been trapped in her stepfather's web of manipulation. "I don't understand," Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you saying, Mia?" "I'm saying," Mia's voice cracked, "that I wasn't the only one he hurt. I wasn't the only one he used. There was someone else. Someone before me. Another girl who he had a similar relationship with. Someone who he didn't just manipulate, he destroyed her." Rachel's mind raced. Another victim? It wasn't a complete surprise, though the idea that Aaron had hurt someone else before Claire was a revelation that sent a chill through her bones. "Who?" Rachel's voice hardened. "Who was this girl?" Mia hesitated before responding. "Her name was Sarah. She was his first, before me. She was younger, much younger, and he promised her the same things he promised me. But when she tried to tell someone, when she wanted to escape, he made sure she disappeared." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. "Disappeared? What do you mean?" "I mean that she's gone," Mia whispered. "I think she's dead, Detective. I think my dad killed her too. But no one knows about her. He made sure no one would ever find her." The words struck Rachel like a hammer. A second victim, one that had never been part of the investigation. If what Mia said was true, then Aaron Williams had more blood on his hands than anyone realized. He hadn't just killed Claire to cover his tracks. He had killed before, silencing a young girl who had dared to escape his grasp. The next several weeks were consumed by the new lead Mia had provided. Rachel reopened the investigation into the missing girl, Sarah. Using the evidence she had gathered during the Williams case, Rachel began to dig into Aaron's past, uncovering things she hadn't been able to before. It didn't take long before she found reports of a missing person from years ago, a young girl who had disappeared from a nearby town. The similarities between Sarah's case and Mia's story were undeniable. Rachel took the evidence to her superiors, who authorized a full investigation into Sarah's disappearance. They exhumed the area near Aaron's old home, conducting a search that turned up a hidden, makeshift grave. The remains found were soon identified as belonging to Sarah. The case was now a double homicide, and Aaron's history of abuse and violence was now completely exposed. Months later, Aaron Williams was charged with the murder of Sarah as well as Claire, and the investigation into his past continued. The jury's guilty verdict still lingered in the minds of everyone involved, but Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that the case was far from over. There were still more secrets to uncover, more victims to find. As for Mia, she left town shortly after the revelations about Sarah's murder. Rachel hadn't heard from her since, and part of her hoped Mia had found a way to heal from the darkness that had consumed her life. Rachel stood outside the courthouse, her gaze resting on the horizon as the weight of the case slowly lifted from her shoulders. She had done her job. Justice had been served. But as always, the question remained. How many others were out there, trapped in cycles of manipulation and abuse, waiting for someone to uncover the truth? As Rachel turned and walked back to her car, she knew that no matter how many cases she solved, there would always be more out there, hidden in the shadows, and she would always be ready to uncover them. For the truth, after all, had a way of never staying buried forever.